Here's what I mean by that. The ancients at Kadesh thought about returning to Egypt. They wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb and probably Moses and Aaron as well, and they talked about selecting a new leader who would take them back to Egypt. They wanted to go back, but the Egypt they were imagining, not only was their memory quite selective in what they chose to remember, but the Egypt they were imagining didn't really exist anymore. Had they returned, they would have found a much different Egypt than the one they left, because Egypt had been nearly destroyed by the very plagues that bought their freedom. It would take years, decades for Egypt to recover from all that they went through because of Pharaoh's stubbornness. And so if they had gone back, they would have not found nearly the same place that they had left. They would have found a decimated country. The fish that they enjoyed, well, fish were all killed by the first plague when the Nile was turned into blood. It would have taken a long time for the Nile to be re-fishable. The fresh produce, all destroyed with the hail and the locusts and different things that happened with those. The cattle had gotten the disease. Just it was not what they left. The entire Egyptian army was destroyed in the Red Sea, so the country was open to bands of marauders and other tribes that lived nearby. Plus, if they had gone back, the attitudes of the Egyptians probably would not have been very good toward them. They probably would have gone back and faced some significant national bitterness, because the Egyptians would have seen the Hebrews as being the source of all their problems. So if they had gone back, they would not have found the same Egypt they left. So that was not the Egypt they were imagining. They were imagining just very selective bits and pieces of their experience back in Egypt, and they were saying, let's go back to that, when in reality that didn't exist anymore. Plus, there's another aspect to their potential return to Egypt, and that is they would have been walking away from God, and they would have been going back to serving Egypt's idols. If you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that Israel was a nation that God made a covenant with, that they would be his people and he would be their God. Have you ever wondered if, when the Israelites were in their slavery in Egypt, if they took part in the idolatry of the Egyptians, or did they just stand by and watch as the Egyptians did their idolatry? I've often wondered about that. I kind of figured that at least some of them probably did, but I got a clear-cut answer this week. My regular Bible reading is in Ezekiel, and in chapter 23 clearly states that many, if not most, did. Now, you can go home and read that if you want to. I strongly recommend that you do not read that chapter to your kids. It has some very graphic imagery in it, but if you read it, just understand what God was saying about the unfaithfulness of his nation, Israel. Well, anyway, so if they had left there and gone back to Egypt, they would have been going back not only to Egypt, but Egypt's idols. They would have walked away from, they would have forsaken the covenant that God had made, and their memory would probably have just been erased from the planet. Original point, they were tempted not by the Egypt of reality, but by the Egypt of their imagination. The first century Hebrew Christians were suffering from that same spiritual malady. They were not thinking clearly about the way to be in a relationship with God, because it wasn't like Jesus is one way, but if that doesn't work out, we can always fall back on our Jewishness. Jesus is the only way. Jewishness itself is no longer even a way. God has burned that bridge. It's either Jesus or nothing. And had they succumbed to the temptation and abandoned faith in Jesus to go back to Jewish legalism, they would have been doing just like the ancients would have been doing if they had gone back to Egypt. They would have been walking away from God, because they would have been they've been walking away from the only way that they can ever get to from God. Because God, all that that tradition of law, that Jewishness and all that stuff, God had moved on from that. God had moved on. It wasn't a way to find him anymore. You know, that's why some of the warnings in Hebrews are so strong. If you've read through the book of Hebrews, you've probably come across some passages that you didn't understand with really, really strong warnings. Well, that's why those warnings were that way. So the ancient Hebrews, they had their Egypt, and the first century Hebrew Christians, they had their Egypt. What's your Egypt?